How do we impact our world? I came across this quote from Denzel Washington. I think we all would agree with it. He said, "Don't just aspire to make a living, aspire to make a difference." Now, not even I'm so cynical to disagree with that. And the world is full of sayings like these. But how do we actually make a difference in the world? How are we going to make a lasting impact on our world? One of the central answers we find in our modern world is that the answer to that question is found within us. For example, Ralph Waldo Emerson said that the key to making a difference is self-trust. Trust yourself over everyone else. Walt Disney and Oprah Winfrey would believe and have us believe that to impact the world around us, to make a lasting impact, we need to be following our dreams. You even find this in advertising today. And so you have Apple. Apple would have us to think different. Adidas have us to think that impossible is nothing. Nike have their famous "just do it," and even GoPro have be a hero in all that you do. And from these and many other examples, we have one clear message in our modern world: to change the world, you need to be bold. You need to trust yourself, because you are unique, and your uniqueness will change the world for the way you want it to be. But as usual, when we turn to the Bible, we find that Jesus is quite different from these expectations. And in today's message, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 to 16, and the Beatitudes of Jesus. And this is obviously Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as a whole challenges this modern idea that to make an impact in our world, we need to trust in ourselves and we need to be the difference. Now, the context of this sermon is that Jesus has come through the temptations in Matthew chapter 4, and he's begun his public ministry. And he's becoming really popular in the region, and people are being attracted to Jesus. And so in chapter 4, we read that his fame spreads throughout all Syria, and he starts to heal lots of people, and he's getting a great following from Galilee and the Decapolis and the surrounding regions. Now, in the midst of this popularity, Jesus wants to teach them the characteristics of the kingdom of heaven. And it's not exactly what people would expect. By the end of this sermon, people are so amazed by it that they find it so unusual and so different, because it's just very unlike what they've usually heard from their rabbis. Now, we obviously today don't have time to go through 3 chapters in the Sermon on the Mount, so we're just going to focus in on verses 3 to 16 and the Beatitudes. Now, the Beatitudes are well liked for good reason, and they're well known, but often they're kind of reduced to these pithy little spiritual sayings that make us feel good and all spiritual and Christian, when I think in reality the Beatitudes are some of the most challenging things Jesus will ever teach. They are some of the more outlandish things as well. The Beatitudes are as countercultural and as counterintuitive as Jesus will ever get. Now, obviously the Beatitudes center around this idea of being blessed. So what does blessed mean? Blessed, the word means happy, but it's not referring to this kind of temporary emotion that we often associate with the word happiness. But it is a deep joy in God that is unaffected by circumstances. And so the blessed people in the Beatitudes, they have a strength of character, of spiritual character, that the world and the devil cannot get at. So this is not an attitude that we can learn from the world, or that the world is going to give us. Now, I'm going to take the Beatitudes in small groups. And the first group is the first 3 Beatitudes, which I think focus on the internal posture of the blessed towards God, towards themselves, and towards the world around them. And so in verse 3, we have the first one: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, this first posture that we find the blessed people in isn't a power stance, but one on their knees in weakness. It is not those who pretend that they have it all together that God blesses and that they have a deep joy in him, but those who acknowledge their spiritual poverty, which in turn makes them draw near to God. This is the opposite of the modern attitude where I am the hero of the story, where my self-confidence and my self-assertion, they're going to be key. Jesus is commending those who see the empty bank account and don't just pretend that it's not there or think that they need to now work up good works in order to impress God, but continually come again and again to God, who is the most gracious benefactor. Now, once again, you see this in the Psalms 116, 6 and 7, and then verse 12 and 13. So the psalmist says, "When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits?" So I was brought low, and God bountifully dealt with me bountifully. So what am I going to do? I find myself again and again needing God. Well, in verse 13, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. So my cup is constantly empty. So what do? I'm constantly poor in spirit. What do? I bring it again and again, my cup again and again, to the overflowing fount of grace. The blessed in the first beatitude know that God doesn't tire of enriching those who know they are poor in spirit. So Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven doesn't belong to those who think that they have it all together, but to those who can sing with Augustus Toplady in his great hymn, "Nothing in my hand I bring." In the second beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So in this second beatitude, we find that those who mourn are blessed, not because they're depressed, but because they look at what sin is doing in themselves and what sin is doing in the world, and they mourn over it. They don't trivialize it. They don't avoid it. They don't try. Let's all focus on the positives, not the negatives. No, they look at themselves and they look at the world and they mourn. I always found it strange that whenever you watch the news, it goes for let's say it goes for an hour. It's 55 minutes of negative stories, corruptions, natural disasters, deaths, murders, things like that. And then at the end, the news always finishes with some dog who can ride a surfboard, and let's all laugh about that and look how funny and great our world is. And then they tell us good night, have a good night. They've given us 55 minutes of depression, bad stories, and yet they want us to feel happy at the end of it. That's just delusional, and it doesn't actually help us. The paradox here in this second beatitude is that it's the joyful, it's the blessed people who mourn. Also, I want to point out, and I think this is particularly relevant in our modern context, Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who critique the world. Anyone can critique the world. You even find Richard Dawkins said that the Western world is poorer for the loss of Christian influence. But it takes no spiritual insight to see that. Okay, you've got a lot of people who can now spot that. But how many people actually mourn in themselves for what they have done and what they see happening in the world? To critique is easy. To mourn takes spiritual character. The third one is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So meekness is to be gentle and humble, because we see ourselves and we see others as God does. It is a Philippians 2 verse 3 attitude. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility or meekness, count others more significant than yourselves. The meek are more than happy to see others succeed, to see others benefit over themselves. And if there is one beatitude that we instinctively think won't have an impact on this world, it's this one. There is no way meekness can have a lasting impact. If I'm the difference, if my crazy ideas and my crazy personality are what the world needs, if self-esteem and self-assertion are the key to having an impact, then meekness will just hinder me. Hitler thought this as well. So this is Hitler's thoughts on Christianity. You see, it's been our misfortune to have the wrong religion. Why don't we have the religion of the Japanese, who regard sacrifices for the fatherland as the highest good, or the Mohammedan or the Muslim religion too, would have been more compatible for us than Christianity. Why did it have to be Christianity with its meekness and flabbiness. See, for Hitler, meekness was weakness. And if you have worldly ambition, if you want to take over Europe, if you're Hitler, or even if you want to follow your own dreams, meekness won't help. That's how we're told the world works. So while the first three Beatitudes really focus on the posture of the blessed to themselves, to the world around them, and to God, the next four Beatitudes focus on how does the desires of the blessed, what desires do they have for themselves and for those around them? And so you have, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. So godly people are marked by his desire not to see personal righteousness, not just personal righteousness, but also to see God's righteousness done in the world. So the joyful in God know it's not about promoting yourself, it's not about your brand, your level of piety, but it's what God wants in this world. Part of his righteousness is to see God's mercy and peace, which they've personally experienced, now be extended to the world around them. We see this in verses 7 and 9. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall see mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Seeing peace and mercy in this world, not self-promotion, is a mark of those who are truly blessed, to those who are truly joyful in God. I recently heard a story that really struck me about the impact that mercy can have. In 2020, Samuel Davidson was driving under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and he hit and killed 3 children, all from the same family. The parents of the children, Denny and Layla Abdullah, lost 3 of their 4 kids. Now, if there's a situation where you will not feel blessed or deep joy, this is it. But in the press conference after, Denny said that they forgave Samuel. Now, I don't know if I could do that. Maybe I could. But this is where Denny Abdullah really challenges me, and where a man whose deep joy in God, deep blessedness in God, is not changed by the circumstances, and where you see God's righteousness shine forth through an incredible act of mercy. See, not only did Denny Abdullah publicly say this, but since 2023, he's actually been meeting with Samuel Davidson in prison and sharing the gospel with him. And Samuel Davidson is now not only Denny's friend, but is also a Christian. See, this man was changed by the mercy of a broken but blessed Father. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The desire to see righteousness, mercy, and peace is driven by a pure heart. Now, this is more than just we don't watch inappropriate videos online, but it's actually it's referring to having a singleness of purpose. So your desires haven't been corrupted by the world around you. This is not a perfect desire. You see that in Matthew 19 when Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler. He says, if you want to be perfect, sell all you have. The word perfect there isn't if you want to be sinless. It's do you want to be a wholehearted follower of me? And so Jesus makes this point again in the next chapter in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So seeking and desiring God's righteousness in ourselves and the world is the singleness of focus that the blessed have. But how's the world going to react to this? You'd almost expect at this stage just for Jesus to say, by doing this, you'll change the world. But in another unexpected twist, even these desires the world hates. So verses 10 and 11, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So we are to hunger and thirst for righteousness, but it's going to lead to persecution. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad. So Jesus wants us to follow him, but it's going to lead to people slandering us. We shouldn't be surprised by that. And so our world is so hell-bent on sin that it persecutes those who meekly seek righteousness, mercy, and peace in this world. So if the world is this hostile, And to us, if the world is so hostile to our faith and to these beatitudes that we're meant to see, they're going to persecute us, revile us, falsely accuse us. Do we then pull back from the world? How are we going to impact the world if the world is going to be this hostile? Now, Jesus in the next section kind of answers this question. And so you have, in verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under feet. Salt was used to enhance flavour and to preserve meat in the ancient world. And so Jesus is calling Christians to have a similar impact. And I think he's wanting us to remember two things. Now, these two things are so obvious, I almost didn't mention them, but we'll go into it anyway. Firstly, we are to attach ourselves to the world. Salt that isn't attached to food has no impact on it, obviously. So we too are not to remove ourselves from the world. This has been my major issue that I've had with monasteries throughout history. That essentially a monastery says that the world is so evil, so let's just avoid it and don't engage with it. And you see this in far too many churches, Christian institutions, families. It's the world is evil, let's just avoid it then. And by avoiding it, then we just leave it to its own devices and, it can go to hell kind of thing. But that's not what Jesus is calling us to do in verse 13. You can't preserve or impact the world from yelling behind a wall of self-preservation and self-righteousness. Christians need to be in the world. And yet, the second point is that salt needs to stay salty. As Jesus warns, if Christians become too influenced by the world and lose their distinctiveness, they are useless. So salt in the ancient world lost its distinctive flavour when it became so corrupted by outside influences. In World War I, some Anglican chaplains in the British Army thought that in order to be accepted and influence their peers, they needed to join in the drinking games and get drunk with the soldiers. That's exactly what Jesus is warning against. The saltiness that we spread, though, is not your unique personality, your wacky hobbies that you're really into. No, it's the Beatitudes attitude. It's this deep joy that we have in God, no matter the circumstances. That is the salty joy that we are to spread. Now, and this saltiness points to something beyond ourselves. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. So the way we impact the world is to be so joyful in God and so Christ exalting in our actions that people see that and they know that these people, these Christians, are different. And I'm going to finish now with essentially a 10-minute sermon illustration. I'm going to do something a bit different. Because I want to ask the question, does this actually work? We can talk about this all we want, but does this actually work? Can you actually act like this and actually have an impact on the world? I think one of the best ways to learn about your faith is not obviously we read the Bible, we pray, we do those things, but also I find that biographies are really important. And I think there's a biblical reason for that in Hebrews chapter 11. I think there's a reason, a whole chapter there dedicated to showing us people who had faith in the past. So I want to do something different here, where I want to see that having that deep joy in God displayed through these Beatitudes have actually changed the world. And I'm going to use an example not from the Bible, but I'm going to use my favourite person biography in history, which is William Wilberforce. Wilberforce is most known for being the leader of the abolition cause against that end of the slave trade. But what's probably less known about him is the way he went about it and the hundreds of other changes he made to the world that he still has an impact today. Now, Wilberforce was born in 1759, in Hull in England, and he was part of a wealthy family. He goes off to Cambridge as a teenager, lives a really ungodly life. The only good thing he does at Cambridge is he becomes friends with a guy called William Pitt, who in a few years' time will become Prime Minister. William Pitt just pressures or convinces Wilberforce to become a politician in 1780. But in 1785 and 86, Wilberforce becomes a Christian. And Wilberforce has this dilemma of, can he actually stay a public politician, or does he need to leave politics and live a more secluded life away from the corruption of British Parliament at the time? He was so confused about the decision that he didn't know what to do, and he goes to see John Newton, who's obviously famous for writing Amazing Grace. And before he walks in to see John Newton, he actually walks around the block of John Newton's place twice, wondering whether he should walk in. He walks in and Newton convinces him to stay in Parliament. And later Newton writes these words: "It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation." So Wilberforce stays in public office, but he's going to stay in order to seek God's righteousness in Britain and the world. But what is it about 18th century England or Britain that needed salt and light? In what ways was it a decaying and dark world? See, life in the 18th century was brutal. Public executions bred a culture of violence and abuse. So instead of going to the sporting stadium to watch the footy or something, you would go watch a public execution. And it bred this kind of violence in society. Poverty was seen as a state that God had given, so it was actually unfashionable and even considered ungodly to help the poor. And so if you wanted to help the poor, there was something wrong with you. Only the very elite people got an education. So most children, they were uneducated. And so the only options for them, really, it was a life of stealing and of crime. And so it's why you find a lot of young children on the first couple of fleets over to Australia as convicts. In London, 25% of the unmarried women were prostitutes. The average age of those women was 16 years old. And the most famous one during the time was the slave trade. The slave trade thrived because it was unseen. People knew that it existed, but it was out of sight, out of mind. And if you went up against the slave trade, the people who were involved in it were so powerful and rich that it was political suicide. You could even get yourself killed if you wanted to get rid of it. So the question is, how was Wilberforce salt and light in that kind of world? Firstly, he was pure in heart, in the sense that he had a single purpose. He wrote that the grand characteristic mark of the true Christian is his desiring to please God in all his thoughts and words and actions, to let his light shine before men. By please God, Wilberforce meant a heartfelt joy in God, and this joy would be light in this dark society. And this wasn't a vague desire, but it expressed itself in the two great objects of his life. So on October 28, 1789, he wrote in his diary, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners." The word manners there means morals. In other words, he wanted to stop the slave trade and he wanted to change the way people behaved in society. Now, he believed God had called him to achieve the impossible, end the, in today's money, billion-dollar slave trade, and change the moral standards of a society that hated his faith and that didn't want him to help. So in other words, he wanted to provide a better life for those teenage girls who were caught in prostitution. But blessed are the persecuted. It was not easy what he did. Wilberforce faced an immense persecution. If you want to take a stand and go against these social issues, well, you better be prepared to suffer. And so there are many things you could talk about. I'm going to talk about three. From 1787 to 1807, every single year, his bill to end the slave trade failed for a variety of reasons. One such reason, in 1796, the abolition bill was defeated 74 to 70, so by 4 votes. And it was later Wilberforce found out that 10 people who were meant to vote on his side, instead of going to Parliament that night, actually went to the opera. And he got so depressed from that, he actually got very sick and almost died. He was constantly a sick person. He did not have a strong body. The other thing is his opposition to the slave trade led to constant death threats. In 1792, two guys, Robert Norris and John Kimber, they were captains of slave ships that Wilberforce was going up against, and they threatened to attack and even kill Wilberforce, that for the next 2 years he had to actually have a bodyguard walk around with him. So this is not just a political issue. This is people who were trying to shut him up. He faced persecution by his character also getting attacked. So this, in August of 1823, so William Cobbett, it'll come as no surprise that William Cobbett actually had slaves. He wrote this on a public little tract that you'd hand out to people. So he writes about Wilberforce: "You make your appeal in Piccadilly, London, amongst those who are wallowing in luxuries, proceeding from the labour of the people. What an insult it is, and what an unfeeling, and what a cold-blooded hypocrite must he be that he can send it forth. What an insult to call upon the people under the name of free British labourers, to appeal to them," as in to British labourers, in behalf of the black slaves, when these free British labourers, these poor, mocked, degraded wretches, would be happy to lick the dishes and bowls out of which the black slaves had breakfasted, dined, and supped. In other words, he was saying, you care more about these African slaves than you do your own people who are living in poverty and who are struggling in life, and you are just a hypocrite. Now, if you are one of those British labourers who are struggling in life and you read that, you could actually have that opinion, because none of this is actually based on fact. And as we'll see, Wilberforce helped the poor more than anyone else, but he's just appealing to people's emotions. Now, humanly speaking, this opposition to Wilberforce should have destroyed him. He was trying to achieve the impossible. John Wesley knew this, and John Wesley writes him this very encouraging letter that I've always enjoyed reading. In 1791, he writes, "Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well doing." So how did he react to his persecution? How did he pursue God's righteousness in a world that hated the faith that he professed? Jesus taught that we are to react with joy, and that this God-filled joy will be salt and light in this world. Therefore, we find Wilberforce, that in Wilberforce, that the joy was the beating heart of his faith. So he wrote that we can scarcely indeed look into any part of the sacred volume, the Bible, without meeting abundant proofs that it is the religion of the affections which God particularly requires. Joy is enjoined on us as our bounden duty. A cold, unfeeling heart is represented as highly criminal. His default emotion to the world around him was not one of bitterness or frustration, but joy, a joy deeply rooted in Jesus. Now, this is probably the thing I admire most about Wilberforce. Wilberforce never allowed the evil and the darkness of the issues he stood up against to twist his own joy in God. So he didn't allow the fact that 1/3 of the slaves that went on the Middle Passage, the passage from West Africa over to the Caribbean, 1/3 of the slaves died on the ships, and often they were thrown overboard alive in order to save money, and that the insurance could actually pay the slave ship owners if they lost that property. He didn't let the fact that the slave trade promoted African tribes to actually fight each other in order to get slaves to trade with them. He didn't allow the fact that British society were willfully ignorant of the horrors of the trade because it made a lot of people rich, even a lot of people in the church. He didn't allow anything he discovered about the slave trade or about society make him into an intensely bitter man. Rather, he followed Jesus' teaching that blessed are those who mourn, and he mourned over the sin he saw in the world. Now, he says this in Parliament on the 12th of May, 1789. Now, you can imagine a politician saying this today. You can't imagine a politician saying this today. "I mean not to accuse anyone, but to take the shame upon myself the shame that we have a slave trade. In common, indeed, with the whole Parliament of Great Britain, for having suffered this horrid trade to be carried on under their authority. We are all guilty. We ought all to plead guilty and not to exculpate ourselves by throwing the blame on others. He wept continually over the slave trade and the state of British society. But like Jesus promised in the Beatitudes, this mourning led to a deep joy which radiated out to others. And so these next three quotes are probably my three favourite quotes about Wilberforce. So this is the kind of man he was. The poet Robert Southey said of Wilberforce, "I never saw any man who seemed to enjoy such a perpetual serenity and sunshine of spirit. In conversing with him, you feel assured that there is no guile in him, that if ever there was a good man and happy man on earth, he was one." His friend James Stephens said after Wilberforce died, being himself amused and interested by everything, whatever he said became amusing and interesting. His presence was as fatal to dullness as to immorality. His mirth, his joy, was as irresistible as the first laughter of childhood. But this wasn't a general joy, just in whatever, but a joy in the Saviour. So Miss Sullivan wrote to a friend in 1815, "By the tones of his voice and the expression of his countenance, he showed that joy was the prevailing feature of his own mind, joy springing from entireness of trust in the Saviour's merits, and from love to God and man. His joy was quite penetrating." So this joy that Wilberforce had wasn't just a private emotion, but one that was fed by hunger and thirst to see God's righteousness known and shown in the world, and has led to an extraordinary impact on world history. So some of the things that he accomplished in his life: he abolished the slave trade in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished in the British Empire in 1833, 3 days before he died. Now, those two things are well known, but what are some other things he actually was involved in? He was involved in founding the Bible Society. He helped found CMS, the Church Missionary Society. He led agricultural reforms that have made food more available for the poor. He organised support for blind and disabled people. He led campaigns to improve housing for the poor. He co-founded the RSPCA. With Hannah More, he set up and funded, with his own personal money, schools for the poor. Now, later on in the 19th century, these schools will develop and the system will develop into what is now known as the state school system. He fought hard in Parliament to allow Christian missionaries to go and evangelise in places like in India, which leads to William Carey going over there, which is found in the modern mission movement. He fought hard to allow a chaplain on the First Fleet to come to New South Wales and to allow missionaries into New South Wales. And he lobbied in 1811, he lobbied for the humane treatment of convicts and Indigenous when Governor Macquarie was Governor of New South Wales. And so he wanted the Aboriginals to be treated well in our country. Now, there's a whole bunch, there's literally dozens of other things he does that I don't have time to actually go through. But I do wholeheartedly agree with Eric Metaxas that, taken all together, it's difficult to escape the verdict that William Wilberforce was simply the greatest social reformer in the history of the world. John Pollock, in his biography, writes, "There is little doubt that Wilberforce changed the moral outlook of Great Britain. The reformation of manners or morals grew into Victorian virtues, and Wilberforce touched the world when he made goodness fashionable." Now, one way you actually see the impact of Wilberforce on the world today is our current view of slavery. So up until Wilberforce, slavery was seen as a necessary evil in the world. But since then, we've worked hard to get rid of slavery, particularly in the Western world, and that all goes back to Wilberforce and those who worked with him to stop that. And it's no surprise that as the world has actually moved away from Wilberforce's faith, that slavery has actually increased in our modern world, so that today we have more than 45 million slaves in the world. Now, I'll finish with this. When the slave trade was abolished in 1807, a parliamentarian, William Bromley, gets up and gives a speech in Parliament that contrasted Napoleon, who was fighting his way across Europe at the time. and William Wilberforce. Now, the world remembers and advocates for attitudes that lead to a Napoleon. You need self-confidence, you need self-promotion, you need arrogance, you need your dreams fulfilled above all else. Yet people like Napoleon destroyed people's lives. And as Romilly put it, Napoleon would be haunted by his guilty conscience. Now, Jesus teaches in the Beatitudes that if you want to see change in this world, these attitudes aren't found in the world. But we do see them. We do see them in Jesus. And we do see them in this 5'2" British politician who was deeply sick most of his life, but who even deeper had a far deeper faith and joy in Jesus that not only changed his life, but changed the world.